You've probably heard of the Dungeon Master, but what about the Caller or the Mapper, or tracking dungeon time in real-world weeks? These aren't homebrew quirks, they were official parts of the game. But why did Gygax and Arneson build these rules in the first place? And why did we stop using them? We're going to dive deep into the forgotten procedures of early D&D today on Daddy Rolled a One. Hello there, and welcome back. I'm Martin, and this is another video in my series on the history of early tabletop role-playing games, including Dungeons & Dragons. Today we're going to be talking about some forgotten concepts that were fundamental to the development and the creation of Dungeons & Dragons, as well as some other early RPGs, but which many new players to the game might not even know existed. So I'm not going to be talking about rules and mechanics in this, although I do have a video on early D&D mechanics, and I'll put a link to that video here in the upper right-hand corner. But instead, I'm going to be talking more about the philosophies, the processes, and the procedures that were essential to these early games and which were critical for understanding how those games were played. And while they may seem antiquated or unnecessary now, at the time, the pioneering players who developed these games and who played these games and dove into them would have been very familiar with pretty much most of these concepts from their background, either as war gamers or just because that's how they learned how to play at the table from the people who created the games. Now, if learning this kind of history is interesting to you and you like learning about the development of Dungeons & Dragons over time, then please take just a few seconds to like the video, make sure you're subscribed to the channel, and that you've hit the bell icon to be notified when I upload new videos. And also that you've set your notification settings on so YouTube will alert you that a new video is available. My analytics show that about 47% of my recent watch time over the past month or so, 28 days, was among non-subscribers. So if that's you, if you could please do me a favor and subscribe, I would really appreciate it. Thanks. Also, if you are looking for further ways to support the channel, there's a few ways you can do that. First, you can become a super fan and join this group of fine folks, and you'll get your name listed in my upcoming videos for helping to support the channel, just showing support and also helping me to upgrade my equipment over time. You can also check out my new spread shop, brand new, with gear that I have, with exclusive designs that you'll only find from Daddy Rolled a One, on t-shirts, hoodies, mugs, and tote bags. You can call it a bag of holding if you want. And these are designs I created especially for you, players and gamers who love Dungeons & Dragons, and particularly old school gaming in general. And whether you're looking for like a dice pattern or a dice patent, I should say, which I really like, or just showing off classic TTRPG vibes, you'll find all of that at my shop. And as a reminder, everything right now through this Thursday, which is going to be May 22nd, 2025, is 25% off since I opened the new shop. That's a promotion that Spreadshop offers. So if you're looking to buy something, now's the time to grab something before that promotion goes away in a couple of days. All right. And if you are more interested in things like stickers and notebooks and posters, I will be opening a new shop soon, and stay tuned for a link for that in future videos. And then lastly, if you are looking to help support the channel, you can buy my old school fantasy adventures supplement, Alchemy, Explosions, and Inventions, which is a complete guide to playing expert characters and campaigns. It's got 15 class concepts or backgrounds. It's got 3 new character classes. It's got new equipment. It has a guild hall with NPCs and secrets and rumors and maps and plot hooks. It's got advice for running a expert themed campaign, and it's got dozens and dozens of random tables that you can use in your games. So please check that out on DriveThruRPG. It's available as a PDF or as a softcover POD in either a parchment or plain white background. And thank you so much for your support. Okay, now let's get back to the content for this video, and imagine that you're at a table and you're told that you can't speak unless your character is in the same room, or the party only has one person that's allowed to talk to the DM. And if your group doesn't play for a month, your character's just been sitting around for 30 days. That's not homebrew. It was kind of like the default. So you might remember some of these from the Moldvay days, but we're going to go back deeper and talk about where these ideas came from Arneson's Blackmore, from Brownstein even, and a little bit in Chainmail. So maybe you've tried or you're tired of railroaded combat, slogs, and every encounter being balanced. And so we're going to talk about that too, the idea of balanced encounters, which I do have a whole video about as well. And I'll put a link to that one up here. And then maybe you're a collector, you've read the books, but you've never really seen this stuff in practice. And so we're going to dive into like how these procedures actually work during the game. And, we're going to talk about things like if you've seen Dungeons on Critical Role as an example. Now you're going to see how they were originally meant to be played. When I say meant to be played, just how they were originally played by the players and how the creators envisioned these games being played. So these are all ideas that I'm going to explore in this particular section here. So what I'm going to talk about are these different procedures. There's going to be 4 in particular, which are going to be the first 4 that I'm going to do a little bit of a deeper dive on and go into like why it's kind of surprising that it's there, the history of where it came from. And I'm going to go over some documented examples of how they were used by the different creators during the games and showing you different quotes from books and things like that. And then I'm going to talk a little bit about why this idea has declined over time, why we don't use them anymore, and then give you some tips. For each one of these, I'll have 3 ideas on how or why you might want to still try to use these ideas in a current game. And it really doesn't matter what edition you're playing, whether you're playing an old school game like me, or whether you are playing 5e or the 2024 edition of Dungeons and Dragons. And then also 3 things to kind of look out for each one of these ideas if you do want to try to implement them. So that will be the focus of that. Then I'm going to briefly go over a few other ideas beyond those 4. Again, kind of procedures that we don't do anymore, but a little bit less of a deeper dive, more just kind of like talking about them in general. All right. Now, the first idea that I want to talk about here is the caller. And then in relation to that, sort of another concept that I'm going to bunch them together, but the idea of limited in-game communication. So this is kind of surprising because if you are playing a modern game, or if you came to D&D later, and, I would say even honestly, by the time I started, and I started in 1981, the play groups were smaller, and the idea that you didn't really talk to the DM, that there was one dedicated person to talk to the DM, might seem a little bit kind of weird because, we're all used to kind of just telling the DM what it is that we want to do. But back in the day, originally, there was a role in the game called a caller. I'm going to talk about what that meant in just a second. And group dynamics used to be a little bit more structured, like militarily. It was very important to write down your marching order, who was where, and there were some games played where if you were at the back of the marching order, the idea was that you couldn't hear what was being said in the front. And so the inter-party communication, especially if you had a lot of members of your party, and we'll talk about that as we go through this video as well. We're used to kind of like the 4-person party now, but back in the day, play groups were much bigger. So it was possible you might have 20 or 30 characters playing in a game. And so the 30th person in line probably can't hear what's happening at the front. And that was part of this limited in-game communication. And, limiting the dialogue and the speech and the discussion between the characters and the DM, it can seem kind of harsh, but it really had a purpose to it. So where it came from, I mean, it's kind of hard to say. It's hard to pinpoint because a lot of the early progenitor games of Dungeons and Dragons didn't necessarily have their rules written down in a strict format the way that we think of Dungeons and Dragons, being written down. But one of the games that I played in, as an example, would be Brownstein, and I played in that at DaveCon last year, April of 2024 in Minneapolis. Now, if you've watched my videos, hopefully you know what Brownstein is, but Brownstein is, I think we can probably call it the first role-playing game. It's definitely role-playing, okay? The game part is a little bit kind of loose because it doesn't seem like it had a fixed set of rules written down, which is what would make it, the game. I guess you could call that part, like the rules part, right? But it's definitely role-playing, and you can watch some of my other videos about it, but the idea here is that we showed up, and I played this game with Dave Wesley, who's the gentleman who invented the game of Brownstein back in the 1960s. Okay, so he ran the game at DaveCon the exact same way or had the same setup that he had way back when he started these games. Okay, so we showed up at the game, and you had to sign up ahead of time so they knew how many players were playing. And he passed out roles. You kind of just raised your hand, and he would hand you a sheet of paper, and it would tell you what character you were going to be playing, what role you were going to be playing. And I was playing a student G. I was a revolutionary student. This takes place during the Napoleonic Wars, and every player had a set of goals. Okay. And so I was student G, which of course, the implication of that means that there's students A through F ahead of me. Well, we were all on the same side, technically. We were all revolutionaries who wanted to see certain things happen. Now, we each had our own sort of individual goals that we were trying to accomplish during the game. But collectively, we were also working toward a common goal, which was the revolution. Okay. And then there were all these other different factions in the town. There was the law enforcement, and there was the aristocracy or the nobility, and there was the civilian government, and there was the religious people. And so it was really, really fun. But what happened was, he passed these roles out, Dave Wesley, that is, and then he kind of just went and sat down and let us figure out what we were doing. Again, there was no necessarily structure to it. And as you went through and figured out what it is that you wanted to do individually, or your characters to do, like your associates. So for me, the fellow students, what we wanted to do, you then once in a while would have to go ask Dave Wesley, how does this work? Or can we do this? Or, things like that. But for the most part, he just sat back and let us run what we were doing. And he was there mainly as the referee to adjudicate things that might happen. The big thing that he had to do was at the very end of the session, there was a combat, and he had to oversee how that combat happened. That's when the dice came out. But before that, there really was no dice rolling, and very little, rules. And, there weren't rounds or turns, that kind of thing. It was a much more free form, very similar to LARPing, if you've heard of live action role playing. Okay. So, but my point with the caller here is that at a certain point, our group of revolutionary students decided on a course of action that we wanted to do something, and we needed Dave Wesley's input on how to make that happen. And rather than all 7 or 8 of us going up to him at once and kind of shouting at him and saying, this is what we were going to do, I just went up and represented the group. I didn't, nobody nominated me. It wasn't like an official thing. And we just kind of took turns doing that. But that gave us each a chance also to talk with Dave Wesley, which was really fun. One of the, I would call him the grandfather of role-playing games. And so I went up and represent. Now, I don't remember what it was that we were trying to do. That's not really relevant to the story. But the idea was we had one person go up and talk to Dave Wesley and say, this is what our group is going to do. And then he told me how to make that happen. And then I went back and reported to the group. And it was much easier for him because he doesn't have a bunch of people swarming around him. And then it was easier for us as well because we had agreed on a course of action ahead of time. Well, that kind of is going to evolve into this idea of the caller in early role-playing games. So, and these are mentioned in the various texts. So this is Underworld and Wilderness Adventures. This is volume 3 of Original Dungeons and Dragons. So here we are on page 12. There's the example of the referee moderating a dungeon exposition. And it says the players equipped and ready are assumed to have located a set of stairs descending to the first level beneath the ground. The referee's part will be indicated REF, ref, that of the caller for the players being shown as CAF. Now, it doesn't really define what the caller is. You're supposed to just kind of infer that as you read through the text. But it says ref steps going down to the east, and then the caller says, we're going down. And the referee says 10 foot, 20 foot, 30 foot, a 10-foot square landing, steps down to the north and curving down southeast. Now, this is going to be important for later as well. And then the caller says, take those to the southeast. And it just kind of goes back and forth. But there's a group of people playing, but the only dialogue that you see happening here is between the referee and the caller. The caller's saying, ignore the door and proceed along the corridors southeasterwards. And then the referee's calling out the number of feet, 10, 20, 30, 40, 50, 4-way, northwest, northeast, south, and southwest. The south passage is 20 foot wide. And then the caller says, go south. And the caller's saying, listen at the east door. And the caller says, 2 of us, and then in parentheses it says, specifying which 2, will throw our weight against the door to open it. All will be ready for combat. So the caller's making the decisions for the group. Now, as we go through various editions of Dungeons and Dragons, that role of the caller, it's going to be explained a little bit better. So here we are looking at module B1. This is In Search of the Unknown. It's one of my favorites. And I am doing a series on all the different modules that TSR put out, particularly up through like first edition. I didn't really play any second edition modules. And I'm doing them like by letter code. So I've done the A series so far, and I'm going to be starting the B series soon. So there will be a deeper dive into B1. But if you look here, this is basically like how to run a game. So this is an adventure, but a huge part of this is basically tips for a dungeon master on how to run an adventure like that, because these were brand new at the time. And so people, were trying to figure out how to play. And so there's a section here that says preparation for the use of this module. And then here on page 4, it talks about one player in the group should be designated as the leader or caller for the party, while another 1 or 2 players can be selected as mappers. We're going to talk about mappers in a minute. Although individual players have the right to decide their own actions and relay them to the dungeon master as play progresses, the caller will be the one who gives the dungeon master the details on the group's course of action as they move around and explore. Such instructions as, we'll move slowly down this corridor to the east, or we'll break down this door while so-and-so covers our rear, are typical directions given by a caller to the DM. In the course of the adventure, the caller will naturally discuss the options available to the party with the rest of the adventurers, but it is he to whom the DM relies upon for the official instructions, although individual players can still pursue alternate courses of action at appropriate times if they insist by telling the dungeon master. Once a caller or any player speaks and indicates an action is being taken, it is begun, even if he quickly changes his mind, especially if he realizes he's made a mistake or an error in judgment. Use your discretion in such cases. So it was pretty strict that once you said this is what we were doing, it was happening. It wasn't like a discussion. So you're going to discuss, the party's going to discuss first, this is what we're going to do, and they're going to agree. And then the caller's going to relay that to the dungeon master. So what the party is saying, the DM might be listening, but in some early cases, that didn't happen. The DM wasn't necessarily listening. He was just waiting, he or she was just waiting for the caller to say, this is what's happening. So, I think this is really interesting. Like Mike Mornard, who's a player from early games, and my understanding is he has kind of the distinction, and it's a unique position to be in, that I believe he's the only player who played in all 3 of kind of the traditional early first tabletop role-playing games. So he played in Dave Arneson's Blackmoor, he played in Gary Gygax's Greyhawk, and then he played in Professor Barker's Tecumseh, Empire of the Petal Throne. And one of the things that Mike Mornard was said in a couple different interviews, he talked about the idea of like when he was playing in Greyhawk, Gary Gygax would sit by a file cabinet, and then he would pull one of the drawers out and kind of hide behind it so like you couldn't see his head. And it was sort of like, I don't want to say he was tuning out, but it was kind of like he was just waiting for people to tell him what it was that they were doing. But for the most part, he was kind of just doing his own thing back there while he was waiting. And also it kind of helped. There was like a disembodied voice coming out from behind this, file cabinet, and you didn't really see his face. You couldn't read his facial expression. So I think that's an interesting way to play. It's not unlike hiding behind a dungeon screen, a DM screen, I guess, these days. But, it gives you a glimpse into how these games were played back then. Well, that's not unlike Dave Wesley just sitting up at the front of the room. He wasn't listening to all of our conversations because there's no way he could have heard them. There were too many separate conversations going on. So he was taking the role again of the referee and waiting for us to come to him if we needed something. But for the most part, we were playing that game ourselves. So that part of the party agreeing upon something and then giving that information to the caller, wouldn't have been foreign to these early players. It would have made sense for them. So they talk about that here in B1. And then if you get to, this is 1981 Moldvay Basic D&D. So on page 19, B19, we have organizing a party. Before entering a dungeon, the player should arrange their characters in the marching order. So we talked about how important that is. A marching order is the order of position in which the characters in a party explore a dungeon, who's scouting in front, searching in the middle, and guarding the rear. Different marching orders may be used when opening doors, searching rooms, fighting combat, and so forth. The most common marching order is to explore in a column of 2 by 2 through this, though this may vary in corridors of different widths. Characters who can wear full armor might be placed to guard the front, and back of the party, while magic users and thieves might be placed in the middle, ready to use their skills when needed. So again, the idea of like, if you're scouting ahead, the other characters don't know what you're seeing until you come back and tell them. So it was very important to have this communication, but again, the limiting of the communication. So, I've done things before where in my daughter's game where the thief character has decided to scout ahead and I pull her out of the room and we go in another room and I say what she sees, because I'm leaving it up to her of whether she wants to share that information with the other groups. Maybe she sees some treasure that she wants to go steal and she doesn't want them to know that it was there, right? So that's how kind of I play it, but that does limit the communication, because then the other players are sitting there wondering what we're talking about. And it does kind of increase the suspense, which I really like, but that's just a way I run the game. So then you have these definitions here. The caller. One player should be chosen to tell the DM about the plans and actions of the party. This player is the caller. The players may tell the DM what their characters are doing, but the game runs more smoothly when the caller relays the information. The caller should be sure to check with each member of the party before announcing any actions, such as will turn right or the thief will check for traps. The caller is usually a character with a high charisma score and should be near the front of the party where the character would be able to see what the DM describes. So again, this idea, it's very clear, like the DM is describing what you see, and then the players have to kind of imagine what that is, because back the way that this was played during the day, you didn't have a virtual tabletop where you were seeing all this. Okay, so those are just a few examples. If we look here, even in Dave Arneson's first fantasy campaign, you guys have seen me talk about this before, but this is basically his notes for having run Blackmore. Okay, and one of the things that he talks about in here, if you see down here, he says, whether there will ever be the coordination of all the area dungeons in the future as they were way back in the good old days is unlikely, but already there are 20 to 30 people meeting every fourth Saturday to do Blackmore and other fantasy and related areas. So who can tell? 20 to 30 players every week playing in this game. So that's going to be important later on for so many reasons. But one of the reasons was, if you've got that many people, you can't have 30 people shouting at once what it is that they're doing. You can have them agree on what it is, and then have one person convey to the dungeon master how they're going to go through this game. Okay, so those are just some examples of how this caller role, you see it sort of over time. They describe it in even in advanced Dungeons and Dragons as well. Okay, so over time it kind of fell out of use because groups got smaller. I talked about that earlier. So if your group falls from 20 players to 8 and then to just 4, well, with 4 players, it's much more manageable. And having a caller kind of seems like it's not really necessary at that point. It can be helpful if the players sort of agree on something beforehand, and then usually you'll just say, okay, this is what we're doing, but it's less of an official role like it used to be. And also, over time, players got more into like role playing. The games became a little bit more story driven, more narrative driven, and especially people who are new to the game who grew up kind of watching, say, Critical Role. I say grew up, but maybe they started watching that, was seeing these people act in character. That used to be less of a thing. I mean, you see like some of these examples of play that I showed you in these early books, people didn't really talk like that. And over time, the sort of one of the main defaults of how to play the game was like speaking in character and maybe adopting a voice or a quirk or a personality. And so if you're doing that and then you're not being able to convey that by having conversations with the DM, it kind of like you lose that aspect of your character. And so people wanted more and more to be able to speak in their character voice. And then, just I think the idea of, being able to participate rather than delegate. So, everyone gets to speak up and say what it is that they're doing. That's an important part. And I think, again, it makes sense, especially with play groups that are smaller. Well, what are some ways that you might want to think about using this concept today if you want to try having the caller? Well, it does kind of help speed up play, especially exploration, and if you have a large group. So I've run groups before. One of the groups that I ran for my long-running campaign that started in May 2001, at one point we had like 9 players. And I played in a game once where I think there were like 9 or 10 players. And I can tell you that we did not have a caller. And sometimes it would take like 2 hours to figure out, like, are we going to go into the room? because people would be arguing back and forth. I mean, I'm exaggerating a little bit, but it sure felt that way. It would take forever, and the DM would just sit and let us argue it out. But like, we didn't have a strong kind of like leader to kind of say like, hey, let's just go ahead and go in the room or whatever it was. And especially things like during combat, like the group deciding ahead of time what they were going to do, and then one person kind of saying, okay, we're going to do this and this. And we were using a battle map during this time. But a lot of times people would just tune out during the combat, and there was no agreement or set of like strategies going forward. It was sort of like every man for himself. So what would happen is, because it was taking so long and there were so many characters, you would be like, standing or sitting around. And then the DM, like when it finally got to your turn in the initiative order, the DM would say you were up. And so many people would walk up to the battle mat and be like, okay, where am I? Like they were not paying attention. They didn't know where their figure was. They didn't know what had happened to anybody else. And they'd be pointing at things like, has this guy been hit yet? Who attacked this guy? What's over here? Like whatever. And then you repeat that by 10 people asking the same question. Now, not everybody did that, but it definitely slowed things down. And I think had we decided to, at least use the example of the caller and figure out ahead of time what it is we're going to do before combat starts, and so that the DM knows who's going to go where, and also the players are engaged and they're paying attention to what's going to happen. So definitely can speed things up. It can heighten the immersion, I think, because it does reduce the table chatter a little bit. And that would be like that limiting the in-game communication, right? So the idea of like, if you aren't there, you don't see what's happening, and so you don't get to comment on it. So, I'm sure you guys have experienced this before when you're playing, where like somebody is having a conversation with an NPC, and it's one player having a conversation, and then other players will start like they're also conversing, but yet they're not even there, or they're back at the tavern and this person's over at the temple, or like whatever it is, but everyone's sitting at the table hearing, and so they all want to comment on what's happening, and you kind of have to remember like, no, you're not there, so you don't get to comment on this part. And again, it can seem kind of harsh, but it does help, I think, with a little bit more immersion, because it limits that amount of like cross chatter that doesn't necessarily make sense within the game. And then, this is going back to an earlier point I make, but it does force you to kind of strategize collaboratively. So if you have a caller, everyone needs to make sure that they're telling the caller exactly what it is that they're going to be doing. So then the caller can, again, make those decisions. Now, that doesn't mean that you don't have autonomy and you can't do things. So again, going back to one of these games I played in, it was a third edition game, but in that game there was a thief player. He was playing a rogue class, but he was a thief, and his secret goal that he had told the DM was that he wanted to become the richest thief in the history of the world, like ever. And so during our combats, a lot of times he would be sneaking off, and we'd be like, where are you going? And he always had an excuse, and we didn't know what his secret goal was. And so he'd say, well, no, I'm going over here because I want to flank this guy so I can sneak attack him. And it seemed completely reasonable. And this player was really good at like writing little notes on like Post-it notes or whatnot. And then he would, during like the combat was happening, well, he would get up and walk around the room, like stretch his legs or whatever. And we found out over time what he was doing was and we never caught him, but he would be passing notes to the DM, and no one's looking at him because they're all looking at the battle mat, and he would make sure no one was looking, and he would pass a note. And basically when he was sneaking off, he wasn't trying to get into a position to sneak attack. He was positioning himself so that he had the better shot at stealing this treasure. And he stole like hundreds of thousands of gold worth of gold pieces from our group over like 10 years of playing in this campaign, like 10 years of real world time. And we didn't find that out until after the game was over. We all just kind of laughed because it really didn't matter, but it was just so funny. Like, he was very clever about it. Now, that's a case where he did have autonomy. And so you wouldn't tell the caller, I'm going to sneak over here and steal all the gold. Of course, you're not going to do that. But I think that's an isolated case, not the rule. So, I think some things, if you are going to try using a call in your game, some things to watch out for would be to, quiet players might end up feeling ignored if they feel like, because they're not going to be talking as much. And then on top of that, the caller's going to be saying everything. And so they might feel like they don't really have much of a say. And also, if your caller has a boisterous personality, it might kind of feel like they're steamrolling over everybody to like make decisions when people didn't get a chance to kind of say what it is that they thought they should be doing. So it can cause a little bit of tension if that caller starts to do that and not pay attention to what the other players are doing and include them in the decision making. And the overuse, I think it can kind of limit the role play a little bit. Again, if you use it too much, and it can also limit any kind of like spontaneous interactions during the game. So I think there's a time and a place for it. Particularly again, if you have a large group. With a smaller group, it's probably not necessary again. But I think it's a good thing to try if you have a larger group. Okay, so the next concept that we're going to talk about, we've kind of already started to hint at this a little bit, but it was a role called the mapper. And it kind of went along with the caller. Usually they're described in the same section, not always, but usually in the rule books. And the mapper just is someone who was physically like drawing the map. And so it's a player drawing the map. And the idea here was that, again, the dungeon master didn't put the map out for you to see. As you saw in some of those earlier descriptions and examples, the dungeon master is explaining what you see. And then it was up to the mapper. Sometimes there might be two, but this is a person who's drawing the map out on graph paper. They're physically mapping what they see. Okay, and then if the mapper makes a mistake, it could be a huge problem. The entire party could end up lost or dead. Why that might happen was because the way that these games were played originally, when you went into the dungeon and delved down in there, at a certain point during the game session, it was assumed that you were probably going to be going back. You were going to be, because you did not want to end the session in the dungeon. And we're going to talk about why that is in a minute. But the idea was that you wanted to get back to a safe place, to your camp, or most likely to like some kind of town, your home base. Okay. And in order to do that, you didn't just tell the dungeon master, well, we're going to leave and go back. You used the map that you had drawn and showed the dungeon master exactly where you were going and what route you were taking that you had mapped out to work your way back to where you had come in so that you could get back to your home base. And again, that's going to be important later to talk about, like, why wasn't it just as easy as explaining, oh, we're going to go back, and then the dungeon master just hand waved it. The reason is because the dungeon master is doing things kind of behind the scenes that might make that map and your route a little bit different than you were expecting. Okay, and the job usually went to a specific player, or like I said, maybe two, but it wasn't the party as a whole. Okay, so one person is doing the mapping. And the idea is the player's doing the mapping, but it also gets represented as the idea of that their character is probably also doing that in the game, that they're stopping at a certain point to like at least do a rough sketch or do something else so that they can see where they're going. Okay, it was a very, I would say, stressful, kind of like high stakes responsibility, because this is the person, if they make a mistake, again, the party could die. So it was common pretty much in all of the early versions of Dungeons and Dragons. Okay, so it doesn't talk about it as much in OD&D, too much, okay? So we saw that example of play here between the referee and the caller. So it doesn't mention a mapper, but the dungeon master, the referee, is calling out these very specific feet, like 10 feet, 20 feet, 30 feet, and telling you exactly, like, it goes northwest, it goes northeast, or it goes south, or whatnot. And so even though the caller is the one that's answering, you can make the assumption that somebody is drawing this map, and that's how they would have played. Okay, so again, we've talked about this before in B1. Well, we didn't talk about it, but we saw a little glimpse of it in here in this section on how to run a game. And so it says down here after the caller. So we have this section up here on the caller that we talked about. Now it says the player or players mapping the explored area should use graph paper. Orient them according to the same direction on the referee's map, with the top being north in almost all cases. After that, allow them to draw their maps from your descriptions as they wish, but make certain that your verbal descriptions of the areas they explore are accurate, although you can say such things as approximately 60 feet, especially in large or open areas or places where there are irregular rock surfaces. Above all, avoid the considerable temptation to correct their maps once they have drawn them. It will not be uncommon for players to show you their map, especially if they're confused, and ask you, is this right? In most such instances, you should avoid correcting any mistakes there unless it would be obvious through the eyes of the adventuring characters. Encourage good mapping skills. and the attention to detail rather than falling into the rut of continual player map questions. So again, the idea is like, so the players technically can't even ask, like, did I do the map correctly? So the dungeon master just has to describe, this is what you see, and then you're mapping it the best that you can based on those descriptions. Okay, and again, we saw that back in here in the Moldvay basic set. We have the caller. Okay, and then the mapper here, it says one player should draw a map of the dungeon as it is explored. This player is called the mapper. Normal movement includes the time spent exploring, measuring, and mapping the dungeon. Maps are drawn to help players visualize the area their characters are exploring and to provide a record of sections of a dungeon that have already explored. A good mapper should listen closely to the DM in order to draw a good representation of the dungeon. It is most important to record proper directions, shapes, and approximate size, rather than spending a lot of time determining exact measurements and filling in minute details. It is also a good idea to make brief notes about where traps, monsters, and unusual features are encountered. A map should be simple and easy to read. Okay, so, and then even if we look in the player's handbook, okay, so this is from 1978 for Advanced Dungeons and Dragons. We've talked about this before, but technically it's a different game. A lot of reasons why. And we see here Gary Gygax, mapping. One player must keep a map of the expedition's trek, and if two players make maps, the chances for the success of the expedition improve. Graph paper with 5 or 6 lines to the inch is suggested for underground map making. A sheet of small-size hex grid is usual for outdoor maps. Both sorts of paper should always be on hand. Never become concerned if your map is not exact, if it is off 10 feet there, here, or 20 feet there, as long as it gives your party an idea as to where they are and how to get back. That's the key, how to get back. It is serving the purpose. Always make notes on the map to show danger, traps, tricks, monsters. So that is the important part of this. And why is that the case? Well, let's look at Greyhawk just to give you an example of how Gary Gygax ran some things. So this is Greyhawk Supplement 1 from 1975. And in this section back here, this is Tricks and Traps Additions. Okay. Now look at some of these things that he's got here. Doors which will only open for certain class of player or to one alignment. Doors which will only open for monsters. Doors which will open to allow traffic into an area, but not out of it. Doors which have an intelligence. A lengthy corridor 20 feet wide, at the end of which is a 20-foot square room, which upon being entered slides backwards with an imperceptible motion, so that when it is left from its opposite side, the party is actually traversing a section of the same 20-foot corridor again. This process can be repeated with one or more additional rooms in a series. Or a passage which slants down one level to a set of stairs which lead to a door to an elevator room which goes down 1 or 2 levels. The exit from the elevator room is another down slanting passage, at the base of which is a slide down. In this way, no less than 5 levels will have been descended, while the party believes that only 2 have been descended. So these are the kinds of things that dungeon masters were doing back in the day, based on the example of Gary Gygax, to throw players off. So that was what the map making was for, was to sort of figure this out. And that's why dwarves have abilities, like you saw the slanting passages in there. That's why dwarves have that ability to detect that. So that if that was happening, like the DM's trying to trick you, and because that's their job, they don't want you to fail. They want you to have challenges that you have to overcome. That's their job, is to create those challenges. And different characters have different abilities to overcome those challenges, and some of them are better at certain ones than others. So dwarves being able to detect those sloping passages would have helped the map maker to understand, oh, we need to add that elevation to this map that we're doing so that we know how to get back. Or those rooms that are like moving imperceptibly slow, but the whole room is moving. And so you're back in the same place where you started, but you don't realize it. So your map is going to be off by how many feet that room moved. And so those were the little tricks that a DM was doing to throw off the map maker. And the idea of doing this then is that, again, you had the map so that you could get out of the dungeon safely. Okay, so that was just some examples there of how that was used. So the reason I think that the mapping felt, because we did it as kids. I still have a map. I meant to grab one. I have like a few of my hand drawn maps, usually drawn during my Spanish class. As the DM would pass me a note and say, you see a corridor going this, like, how many feet and stuff. And then he would make me draw it and pass it back to him. And we would pass that back and forth so that I was mapping. And my maps were usually not entirely accurate, but they were close. But we did it. But, over time, like in third edition, it was very rare. Again, in my long running game. And partly that was just because, we were using battle mats. And so when you did that, because third edition was all about that tactical movement, you needed to know where everything was. And so I would draw it out. I would say, okay, this is the room that you're in. And I would draw up the room, and then I would place all the objects and stuff on there and then place the figures. So I think, the use of battle mats, tiles, DM maps reduce the need for the map making role, the mapper role. And then modules, the adventures over time started to be much more straightforward and linear. All those little tricks that we were talking about here from Greyhawk, those became less and less prevalent over time in the modules. And so because of that, then the map maker didn't, it was very clear with the way things were going, because you weren't trying to navigate through all these different tricks to figure out like where exactly you were in the dungeon. And then it can definitely slow down gameplay. If the mapper is stopping like every few seconds to go, wait, is this right? How many feet was that? Which direction was it going? And maybe they didn't hear other people are talking, and so they're constantly stopping. It can definitely slow things down. And then you're removing yourself out of the immersion of the gameplay, the stress and the anxiety that you want to keep up during the game. As the dungeon master, you want to keep that level of anxiety high. It completely goes away when you're stopping constantly to answer questions to the mapper. So definitely that's a reason. And then, a lot of people just don't like doing it. They didn't enjoy the responsibility having to draw the map. I definitely remember playing as kids, and sometimes we would argue about not wanting to be the map maker because nobody really wanted to do it. And then, for me, especially like in my daughter's game, they don't map. I thought about doing it at the beginning, but it's much more theater of the mind. So, and again, I've talked about this before, but in the games that I run, I assume a certain level of character competence. So these are adventurers that are used to this thing. So my default assumption is that unless there's a reason, like I might put in like one of those little tricky things that might throw them off when they're trying to get out of the dungeon, because that's fun once in a while. But that would come up narratively through, like I said, theater of the mind, as opposed to from a map. I would say like, oh, when you go back this way, you were heading back this way, but something's wrong. Like that corridor's not where it's supposed to be, or something like that. I would describe it. But then I'd let them figure out like how they're going to get around that. But I think, that kind of play, that the theater of the mind, and that's one extreme, is the theater of the mind where you have no map at all. The other one is when people are playing on a virtual tabletop, like on a Roll20 or whatever it is, where everybody can see everything. Some of them that do have that fog of war, but the idea is that you don't need the mapper because you can see the map. Everyone's looking at it on a screen. I don't play that way. I'm terrible at playing online games like that, but I know a lot of people do. And so that's the other extreme, which is that you don't need to have a mapper because everyone can see the map. So that's kind of why it fell away. So I think, there's no reason not to kind of try this today. I think it could be fun. It definitely increases the tension for the map maker needing to get everything sort of, as correct as possible. And it can increase the immersion. Again, I did talk about how it does slow things down, so which takes you out of the immersion. But I think the idea of like you are adventurers and you need to figure this out as you go along definitely could help to kind of increase that level of tension. It makes you pay much closer attention and be much more cautious as you're exploring things. I think it does definitely enhance the teamwork of the players, because everyone, the mapper's doing the map, but other people are going to say, no, he said this or that, or like it goes this way, not that way, etc. And then it does have real stakes. The map making really only makes sense if the dungeon master is going to require that the characters need to explain how they're getting back out of where they were. But doing that creates this sense of like, you need to get this map correct in order to like, make sure that your party is going to survive. And so I think that can definitely raise the level of stakes and raise that tension. But, to watch out for, again, talking about this, it definitely slows things down. So you'd have to watch out for that. And that's part of the reason why I didn't want to use it in my game. My players were all new. And I knew that I was going to not, be using maps during the game and minis and things like that. So I kind of just felt like I'm going to skip past this so that we can get to, more of the action and that kind of thing. It's definitely, people might feel pressured, and it is a high pressure role, and some people just might not want to do that. And then lastly, it does really require the DM to be extremely clear in how they're describing things. And just quite honestly, I'm not great at that. So a lot of times I'm making things up on the fly, and I have it envisioned in my head, but I might not always explain it that well. And so it would require a lot more work on my part as the DM to make sure that I have those exact dimensions worked out. And a lot of times I don't. A lot of times I don't even use maps. I just have encounters. And I know that certain encounters are going to happen, but I don't have them written up on a map. And so it would cause me to run things in a different way. Okay, and the third thing that I wanted to talk about was the idea of one-to-one time and living dungeons or living campaigns, living worlds, whatever you want to call it. So this is the idea that for every day that passes by in the real world, a day passes by in the game world, at least when you're not playing. Okay. So, and this is something that is, I think, very foreign to a lot of people. So most people assume that the world pauses when the players aren't around, and then it resumes when you come back to play. But the original idea is that time moved forward whether the players are doing anything or not. So if you play every other month, or let's say you play once a month, well, then a month of time has passed in between when you stopped playing until you play again. So the idea is that it's very tightly linked to the idea that the world is moving and evolving regardless of the actions of the players. And in early games, you had like we saw in the First Fantasy campaign from Dave Arneson in his Blackmoor game, he had up to 30 players every week. Well, now those 30 players aren't always adventuring at the same time in the same area. Okay. And so that was one of the reasons why having this one-to-one time management was so important, because the idea was that you wanted to prevent a certain group from getting an advantage over another group if they say they played more often or whatever it was. So you wanted to make sure that the actions of one group of players would have an impact on another group, meaning that if a group of players went into a dungeon and explored a certain area, and then the next group of people went into the dungeon and explored that area, you had to know how much time had passed and what might have happened in the intervening time that the first players went in there. So maybe the first group of players goes in and gets the treasure, and then they clear out the monsters. Well, the dungeon might have, depending on how long it's been, the dungeon might have repopulated and restocked. And then when the next group of players get back, then they have to deal with another group of monsters being in that area that had been cleared out by the first party. So keeping track of all that stuff was really, really important for the dungeon master. So you have people dropping in, people who are competing. There's competing factions of players. So those 30 players might have been in groups of maybe 3 groups of 10, or it could have even been 6 groups of 5 or whatever it was, right? And they don't even have to be equal. You know what I'm saying? But that was a normal way of playing. So, when Dave Arneson's running his Blackmoor games, he's not running one Blackmoor game for one group of players and then another Blackmoor game for another group. He's running the same game. They're just not playing at the same time. And so it was important to understand the actions of one group and how that will impact the actions of another group. And so recently, I know there's a video channel, I think DM Lair, and he talked about this idea, and he goes way more in depth than I'm going to go into here. It's a really good video. One of the things that he does say, though, is that Gary Gygax created this idea for his Greyhawk campaign. Well, that's not really true. And it started at least at minimum with Dave Arneson and his Blackmoor games. So it's been pretty well documented that Dave Arneson's players dealt with this issue, and they kept track of time. So this was mentioned by the folks over at The Secrets of Blackmoor, that documentary about Blackmoor, and in a few different blogs. There's one blog, and I just forgot the name of the blog, but the author of the blog, his name's Daniel Boggs. He's commented here before a few times. on the channel. But they both mentioned this character sheet by Dave McGarry, who's the guy who created the game Dungeon with the exclamation point, the board game. But he was a player in Dave Arneson's Blackmore game. And they both of them have a copy of his character sheet. I'll see if I can put an image up here on the screen. But you can see he's keeping track of what's happening, like, day by day, week by week within the campaign. And so they were tracking these kinds of things. And they talked about how at one point over the summer, Greg Svensson, who's the player behind the character of the Great Svenny, he was called. So the player had to leave over the summer. I forget what the reasons were. It's not important, but he was gone for like 6 weeks. Well, the group kept playing while he was gone. And at a certain point, his character ended up dying because of the decisions that the group made about where that character would be during these things that were going on in the game. And so what I read was that he ends up, Greg Svensson ends up, his character is like documented, I think, the first, or at least among the first of the players to be resurrected in a role-playing game, because he was gone and they wanted to figure out a way to bring him back, but they didn't hand wave it and just say like, oh, he's gone for 6 weeks and then you could, like, they kept playing and things happened during the game. So again, documented that this happened in Blackmore before Gary Gygax included it in his Greyhawk games, which then of course those two games evolve into becoming Dungeons and Dragons. So we know that Gary Gygax, or that Dave Arneson, included it in his games. So, and there's many other places where it's discussed. So if you see here, going back into original Dungeons and Dragons, again, this is book 3, Underworld and Wilderness Adventures. Down here at the bottom on page 35 says time. As the campaign goes into full swing, it is probable that there will be various groups going every which way and at all different time periods. It is suggested that a record for each player be kept, the referee checking off each week as it is spent. Recon the passage of time thus. I think that should have been record, but whatever, he says recon. But this is very close to like that system that we saw that Dave McGarry was doing in the Blackmore games, this idea that each player is going to keep a record of how much time is passing. Okay, and then he says, for a dungeon expedition, that equals 1 week of time. Wilderness adventure equals 1 move is 1 day. And then 1 week of actual time in the real world is 1 week of game time. The time for dungeon adventures considers only preparations and a typical 1-day descent into the pits. The time for wilderness expeditions would include days of rest and recuperation. Actual time would not be counted off for players out on a wilderness adventure, but it would for those what does it say? Nude in their dens, hide holes, keeps, castles, etc., as well as for those in the throes of some expedition in the underworld. So the idea of like just this right here, 1 week of actual time is 1 week of game time. So during the game, you're usually not tracking your time that way. It's not like you're sitting at the table and a minute passes and that means a minute passed in the game. Usually during the game, while you're playing, time's going to progress much more quickly. Okay. And a lot of times you're going to do things like you're going to do overland travel, and that might take days of time. And you're going to, unless there are any encounters going to happen during that time period, you're going to just move past it and then get to, and a few days have passed. Right. But once you stop playing, that's when the real time is going to kick in until the next session. And that's how much time has passed. And that's why I was mentioning before during the mapping section, that's why it was important not to end a session in the middle of a dungeon, because then that would mean that the players are stuck down there until you get back together again to play. And if you play like my players do, which is at most we play once a month, that is a long time to be stuck in a dungeon and have supplies and fend off monsters that are trying to, it doesn't matter how well you fortified your position. There's no way after a month's worth of time. So it is very difficult to do if you don't play frequently. If you're playing every week, that makes more sense. But, my groups tend to play roughly like once a month at most. Okay. But that's mentioned in here. And then it's mentioned in the Dungeon Master's Guide as an example. So I think I mentioned this before, but I did finally get a copy of the original Dave Sutherland, the third cover with the Ifrit. And this was a gift from a nice viewer who had an extra copy named Brian. And he offered to send this to me as a thank you, which is really nice. So I finally have this book. I've only ever had the Jeff Easley cover, which I quite like as well, but it's nice to have the original. But here's the whole section on time in the Dungeon Master's Guide 1979. This is page 37. Time in the campaign. Game time is of utmost importance. Failure to keep careful track of time expenditure by player characters will result in many anomalies in the game. The structure of time is what makes recovery of hit points meaningful. Likewise, the time spent adventuring in wilderness areas removes concerned characters from their base of operations, be they rented chambers or battlemented strongholds. Certainly, the most important time structure pertains to the manufacture of magic items, for during the period of such activity, no adventuring can be done. Time is also considered in gaining levels and learning new languages and more. All of these demands upon game time force choices upon player characters, and likewise numbers of their days of game life. So this is probably the most famous quote about time in Dungeons & Dragons, again, from the Advanced Dungeon Master's Guide. One of the things stressed in the original game of D&D was the importance of recording game time with respect to each and every player character in the campaign. In AD&D is emphasized even more, and then in all caps. You cannot have a meaningful campaign if strict time records are not kept. So Gary was very big on this because that's, again, how they played these games back then. That's going back to the original Blackmore game and things happening in the game world. So, and he talks about it even going as far back as, I mean, it's mentioned obviously here in D&D 1974, but in Strategic Review, issue number 7, I believe this is. It's volume 2, number 2, which I think makes it number 7. I always get confused on that. But it's mentioned here, I think this is 1975. He says, another point to remember is that you should keep a strict account of time. The wizard who spends 6 months writing scrolls and enchanting items is out of the campaign for 6 months, and he cannot play during these 6 game months. And if the time system is anywhere reflective of the proper scale, that means a period of actual time in the neighborhood of 3 months. So again, he's trying to impress upon people, and I think a lot of people were confused by this. And so he's explaining that, like, you know, especially for somebody like a magic user who's going to research spells or try to create magic items, that's not something that you just hand wave and then you come back and you're still fine. Like, it's going to take 6 months to make whatever this magic item is. Well, the game world moves on. And unless the other players are in agreement that they're going to stop adventuring for 6 months, you might be out while the other players are still going and doing things. And that character, that magic user is not going to be adventuring or gaining experience points and all that kind of stuff during that time period. So I also understand, like Rob Kuntz, one of the original players, you see his name here on Greyhawk Supplement 1. So he played, he was one of the first people that Dave Arneson showed. Like, I believe he was there when Dave Arneson ran a game of Blackmore for Gary, and like, I think Ernie was there, Ernie Gygax, and I think Luke Gygax was there, and Rob Kuntz and Rob's brother Terry. But my understanding is that he used that principle in his own games, his Castle El Raja Key, and that players who skipped sessions found rooms had been altered or rivals had advanced their goals and things like that. And that's a great way to use this idea of real world kind of one-to-one time, is having rival adventuring groups doing things. I've done that in my daughter's game so many times, where I've had a rival group basically follow them through a dungeon. And then once they figure out what's going on, they might sneak into a different area and spend more time looting, because the player characters have already gone through and cleared out the monsters, and they haven't had time to loot yet, because, again, looting takes a turn. And that's another thing of, like, keeping track of this time. It doesn't just happen like that, like instantaneously. All these different things take turns. And the reason why that's important is because every so many turns, the dungeon master is checking for wandering monsters to see what comes through. So the players have to make a decision. Is it worth stopping now? Or do we want to finish clearing out this whole level and then come back and loot? Well, if that's what they did and this rival adventuring group's there, they might end up stealing this treasure out from underneath the player characters. I haven't done it that many times because it can get old, but it's happened enough where they really hate this rival adventuring party, because they've realized that they are kind of like sneaking around and taking credit for things that the player characters are doing. So I think real world time is really interesting. Definitely check out that video on DM's Lair, because he's going to give you a lot more details on how to implement it during a game. But I think, it sort of fell out of use because smaller groups where you don't have 30, 50 people adventuring in the same world at the same time and wanting to do things, and you need to keep track of all that kind of stuff. When you have a smaller group and it's just 4 players and there's nobody else involved, this persistent world idea kind of doesn't necessarily, it's not necessary, I guess you could say. And games kind of over time have really shifted away from this idea of sandbox style play. And a lot of people still play that way. That's how I play. But a lot of people now play these more sort of story driven, narrative driven games where the world moving on isn't really as important as the player character's role in the world moving on. So I definitely have played. I tried to run an old school game for some of my players once, about 10 years ago or so. And they really, one of them in particular, really didn't like the idea that his character wasn't somebody important who was doing something in the world that made a difference. And the idea that other things might happen that his character wasn't involved with, like he didn't like that style of play, and that's fine. That's just how he's used to playing. But I think that's much more common now than it was back in the day. And it's definitely, I think, for me, the biggest downside of doing the real world time is that it's extremely hard to coordinate with irregular schedules. So if you are going to use real world time, you definitely have to have a strict schedule of playing. I definitely think you don't want to go much more than a week between sessions. And you have to have this idea of like, you're going to play regardless of who's able to show up or not. And for the game that I run for my daughter and her friends, we don't play that way. We take turns at who's going to host. And the impetus for us getting together is so that there's a scheduled time for these three young women players and the one dad, but it's really the three girls, the three women. I should say women now. They're almost 16. But they it's for them to get together because none of them go to the same school. So they've known each other since they were like, some of them since they were, I always say like since they were 0, but like since they were a few months old. And then another one came into the fold when they were like maybe 3. And so they've known each other forever. They were in Girl Scouts for a while. And then they were in ballet. Some of them were in and stuff, but they've never gone to the same school except for a brief minute at a time. Like 2 of them went to the same elementary school for like kindergarten and first grade, but they're all sophomores now in high school. And so they don't see each other that often. So D&D is really the scheduled time for them to get together, where if we just said like, oh, do you guys want to hang out? Somebody would drop out. So my point is that we don't play unless all 3 of those girls are available. And if one of them's not, we don't play D&D. The other 2 might get together and do something else, like go to a movie or something. But D&D is saved for when they're all available. And so because of that, that's why we don't play more than like once a month, because their schedules are so busy. And so trying to implement real world time in a game like that just really wouldn't work, because, a month passing between every single time that they play, like it makes it difficult to implement things like time clocks to add pressure to like do things and stuff like that. Oftentimes they will end in the middle of combat. And it's just because it's late, whatever, the other parents have shown up. We always do a potluck dinner after I've mentioned that. And so if the other parents are sitting there waiting around and we've gone like 45 minutes past when I told them we were going to stop playing, and we're in the middle of a combat and I don't see it ending anytime soon, I will call an end to the session and we'll pick up with combat at the beginning of the next session. And so you can't do the real world time then, because what would have happened during that month of time or whatever. So those are all reasons that I think it kind of, it fell out of use, and how it's hard to try to implement it these days. So kind of like things to watch out for. But it does encourage player urgency and decision making, I think, because if you know that by the end of the session you have to be back to your home base, or you have to have finished what your goal is, it will prevent dilly-dallying and kind of like needless chit-chat. You'll like focus and get things done. And it does make the world feel much more alive. I do agree with that for sure. Now, there are times when we have in my daughter's game, they've finished something and they've gone back to town. And in those cases, like sometimes in between sessions, I'll say, okay, 2 weeks have passed or whatever it is. And then I say, tell me what you were doing during those 2 weeks. What was your character doing? And sometimes that will end up having an impact during the game. But a lot of times it's just a chance for them to kind of just be a little bit creative about what it was they were doing, especially if they want to go shopping, because I don't want to role play shopping during the game. And they're okay with that. And again, I really do like the rival adventuring parties. I think that's a great way to work it in during the downtime that passes between sessions. So, again, I did talk about that earlier. And if you want to hear more of like those kinds of stories about how I do things for my daughter's game, I do have a series on here called GM Advice. I used to call it Campaign Prep, whatever you want to call it. It's me talking about the game that I run for my daughter, but more broadly, it's just talking about how I run sessions and how I implement certain old school rules into a modern. I don't want to say a modern game because I'm playing 1981 BX. I'm playing this with my daughter, but there's a lot of stuff from here that I don't use, and there's a lot of stuff from like modern editions, like whether it's Shadow Dark or 5e that I do use. And so I talk about how I kind of integrate those in that series of videos, that playlist. So definitely check it out. There was a viewer recently who left a comment on one of those videos. So, and forgive me, I forget your name. I know it starts with a P. It's like pour something. POR. It's a long name. Again, forgive me for forgetting, but made a comment that, and the comment was basically something like, come for the lore, but stay for like all of these like GM tips. He's like, I was tempted to skip these. Like I wasn't going to watch them, but I caught one of them because there's been a few where I cross tagged them. I said, well, this is about history, but it's also going to involve advice. And so I put it in both playlists. And he's like, or I assume it's a he, says like, this is like gold, like this stuff that's in here. I'm paraphrasing. And he says, especially learning like a first time party that's never played before and like some of the decisions that they make. So I do encourage you to watch that if you get a chance and check out that playlist. All right. So if you are going to implement real world time in your game, some things to watch out for are that players can feel punished for missing sessions. 100%. That's a huge part of this. It does require diligent tracking by the DM in between sessions. So that takes a lot of time. And world changes can invalidate the player's plans if they were going to do something, but instead of what they planned to do, the DMs just move things along and said, oh, this is what happened. And then the players can kind of feel like, well, they don't have as much agency because they weren't involved in that. So again, it just kind of depends on the kind of game that you run with your players and what they're used to. Okay, so that is one-to-one time tracking and living dungeons. Okay, now the fourth sort of forgotten procedure that I want to talk about, a forgotten concept from early games, is the idea of henchmen, hirelings, and retainers. So I think it's pretty obvious from the name what this is, but this is when player characters would be accompanied into the dungeon or on the expedition by a host of people that they had hired or that followed them on the adventure. And these could be, torchbearers, they could be men at arms. There was a lot of different roles, someone to take care of your horses, someone to, carry loot or guard loot. Maybe you are, and a lot of times you would use them for things like, testing for traps. These were people that took jobs, and part of their job, if it was set up front in the job description, might be you're going to go check for traps in the room, not the player characters, right? So, I think a lot of people can be surprised by this because, again, I think that the idea is that the player characters are the stars of the show, and which they are. But I kind of feel like, games these days have changed to where those are the only people adventuring. A lot of people kind of almost feel like it's cheating if you have other people to do these other roles for you during the game, these other jobs. And but back in the day, this is how you survived. It was part of your party's survival to have these non-player characters as part of your adventuring party. And there were complete rules for their loyalty and their morale and things like that. We're going to talk about this. So this is really rooted, I think, mostly in wargaming, you could say, where players were commanding groups of troops. So, in war games, like a figure didn't represent a figure. It represented, 10, 20, 100 soldiers or knights or whatever it was, whatever kind of game that you were playing, right? So this idea that you had a large party or large group of people that you were in command of would have been, again, second nature to some of these earlier players from wargaming. And it goes all the way back to 1974, original Dungeons and Dragons. And you see in here, in the section on player character abilities, it talks about charisma. And if you've seen my video on like ability scores in Dungeons and Dragons, why there are only 6, that was a fun earlier video that I did. But I mentioned how if you look at the explanation of abilities, the only one that has a table for what it does is charisma. Charisma was so important. It's not the dump stat that like how people treat it now. Charisma was supremely important because it told you how many hirelings you would be able to hire based on your charisma and what their loyalty was going to be. And their loyalty is going to affect like whether they run away at the first sign of danger. Okay. So that was super important to make sure not only do you have a lot of these, but that they're not going to leave you in a pinch. Okay. So that goes all the way back here. And then it gets into all these details, like this whole section. In all probability, the referee will find it beneficial to allow participants in the campaign to hire into service one or more characters. At times, this may be nothing more than a band of mercenaries hired to participate in and share the profits from some adventure. However, it is likely that players will be desirous of acquiring a regular entourage of various character types, monsters, and an army of some form. Non-player characters can be hired as follows, and then it gives you this whole section here on how to hire them. Again, it tells you how to tell if they're going to accept the offer. If you try to hire them based on your charisma, is going to affect this dice score. It's a 2d6 roll. So, and then it says like, an uncertain reaction leaves the door open to additional reward offers, but scores under 6 do not. And then the loyalty of non-player characters, and what their loyalty is, like, their morale, if it's 3 or less, will desert at the first opportunity. So again, that's why you wanted that charisma score, because if you had an 18 charisma, your loyalty base was up by +4. So the lowest it would be here, it would be a 7, right? So very, very important to have that. So those are the rules that's in here. And then it's explained even more as you get into advanced Dungeons and Dragons. So the Player's Handbook from 1978. So we have page 39 here in the Player's Handbook, all about hirelings. At any time, a character may attempt to hire various different sorts of workers, servants, or guards. The success of such hiring is entirely dependent upon the availability of the type desired, wage and bonus offers, and to some extent, the character's charisma. Typical hirelings are, and then it lists alchemist, armor bearer, blacksmith, crossbowman, engineer, link boy, man-at-arms, steward, teamster, and valet. Your character will have to locate the whereabouts of whatever type of hirelings he or she desires to take into service, and it will be up to your character to determine wages and salaries in the area he or she is in. And then it talks about the employment, and then it talks about henchmen, and it says henchman is more or less devoted follower of the character. In return for the use of his or her abilities and talents, the henchman receives support, lodging, and a share of his or her master's or mistress's earnings in the form of stipends or as a share of treasure token. Henchmen are always of a character race and character class, but are never player characters. So again, you're putting a whole section in this book to talk about that. And then it goes even further detail here in the Dungeon Master's Guide from 1979. So you see here, this is a whole section on the types of people that you can hire. So these would be things like sages, shipmasters. Okay, so look how long this section is. Bearers and porters and carpenters, leather workers, liners, link boys, masons, pack handlers, tailors, teamsters, valets, and lackeys. And then it describes what all these do, what their monthly cost is for hiring them. Okay, and then this is where the sage is located, and the sage abilities is in here. Sage characteristics, so a lot of this is coming out of what was in Blackmore Supplement 2 and then kind of just expanded. Okay, and then a section here on henchmen. And you've got this great cartoon here. I always loved these. I believe that's McLean. Forget his first name. I want to say Dom, but I don't know if that's right. But then you have this section here on henchmen and level of prospective new henchmen, race of prospective henchmen. So just how long this section is in the book here, and their loyalty and all that kind of stuff. It takes up like 10 pages, I think, roughly, starting with the hireling section. So it takes up quite a bit of real estate in the Dungeon Master's Guide just to talk about that. So very, very important part of early playing. So in Blackmore, predating Dungeons and Dragons, characters routinely hired mercenaries. They had, people with them when they were adventuring, at least from what I understand. So there's a whole list in here of stuff. There's, armories, animal breeding, hunting, shipbuilding. Now, these are all activities and investments, but it involves people and non-player characters doing these things. So it talks about like fishing boats arriving and carrying 25 or more people. So again, the idea that characters were hiring people to do these other activities. The characters aren't doing it themselves because that's not really part of the adventuring group. Okay. In strategic review, number 2, Gary Gygax is talking about morale, and he says occasionally, however, it is necessary to check either troops serving with a party in whatever respect or the morale of intelligent monsters. So this was just an accepted part of the game. He says troops under the characters, hire. So people would have these things, and everyone just assumed that you were going to have these. So it's also discussed in, again, B1 in Search of the Unknown. So I feel like B1, which is the module that eventually is placed into the Holmes Basic set. Originally, Holmes Basic didn't have a module. It had the Monster and Treasure assortments, and I think Dungeon Geomorphs. It's either one or the other or both. I can never remember. But later printings of the Holmes Basic set included this adventure, in Search of the Unknown by Mike Carr. But this has your advice on like how to run the game. And so one of the things that it talks about in here is exploring adventures and like, hiring people and like to have with you as you're exploring the dungeon here. And then now what's interesting is that this idea of hirelings and henchmen is still being discussed all the way in 1987. So this is after Gary Gygax has been forced out of TSR. This is about 2 years before second edition Advanced Dungeons and Dragons is going to be published. But this is Dragon Magazine issue number 117. Okay, and this is from January of 1986. Okay, so, sorry, I thought it was 87. But there is an article in here on page 43, The Forgotten Characters by Thomas M. Kane. And so in this article, it's all about a look at henchmen, hirelings, and followers. So just page after page discussing the ideas of hiring people and how to use them. Followers, kind of breaking them up. What's the difference between all of these? And then previous lives of what did these people do before they were hired? Personality and morale, all that kind of stuff is discussed in this article. So this is, I would say this is it's definitely later. This is post Dragonlance, which is the really kind of not the only one, but it's sort of a watershed moment in this shift to like more story-based adventures. And yet you have this whole article here talking about hirelings. And then just 2 months later, issue number 119 with one of my favorite covers ever. This is by Daniel Horn. I believe the title for this painting is "The Real Reason the Romans Left Britain," if I remember correctly. It's something like that, right? But there is yet another article in here on page 54, Henchmen and Hirelings by a completely different person, Charles Olson, an update and review of the rules on those special NPCs. So these two articles would have been written completely independent of each other. It's just funny that two people were thinking about this idea and they published that, that close to each other. But yet another article about henchmen and hirelings and how to use them in the game and the rules for doing so. So these are things that people were still interested in. At least some people were still interested in. And, it's very likely, look how long this article is, but it's very likely that these were players that have been playing since the early days and might have been seeing that these concepts were sort of falling out of favor and wanting to make sure that they were dealing with it so that other people could see that. So speaking of Dragon Magazine, I do have a whole sub playlist of my history series that is going through Dragon Magazine like issue by issue. I usually cover about 2 in an episode and go through and talk about like the writers and the creators and especially those where you first seeing them write things and then like what did they do later on in their careers of role-playing games, if anything, and talk about a lot of the concepts. So Dragon Magazine was one of my favorite things to get back in the day, and there's a lot of great ideas in here. So definitely you want to check out that playlist to keep up to date on that. I think I'm up to I think I've gone through issue 17. So, and I did all 7 issues of the strategic review before that. So why did henchmen and hirelings fall out of use? Well, later editions are emphasizing that kind of single hero fantasy. And that's something that you definitely see even just in the cover art. So if you look at the art for the player's handbook here and you see this group of adventurers, doing all these things. I've talked about this before. And then you look at the cover for the second edition Advanced Dungeons and Dragons, where it's just a single character. I mean, there's other ones in the back, but the focus is on this one. Or the cover of the Beck Me Red Box by Larry Elmore, where it's just a single fighter taking on a dragon. It's a shift away from this idea that you have a whole party of people, but it's more focused on just like, a handful of people. There's definitely a lot more bookkeeping involved with keeping track of your hirelings and how much you're spending, what's their morale and what's their loyalty, and different ones have different loyalty, and you have to keep track of all that. And it can be a lot of feel like accounting at a certain point. And the game itself, if you play newer editions, has shifted over time to focus on stronger individual player characters as opposed to adventurers who become heroes. The players start out as heroes and they become even better heroes. And that comes with these powers and abilities in, like, say, third, fourth, and fifth editions, if you play those versions, where you don't feel like you have to rely on other people because you should be self-sufficient because you have all these abilities and skills and feats and powers and spells and blah, 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 right? So I think that's another thing that kind of happened to kind of take this out of the common play styles. So if you want to use it today, it definitely adds tactical options and backup in deadly situations. So in my daughter's game, they hire hirelings, and it's fun because they like to pick and choose who they're going to hire, sort of based on the personality that I've role played them as. And so I have to have like my random tables ready to go because I never know at what point they're going to want to try to hire somebody when they're in town. And so I will have like a table of names, of course, but also have like little personality quirks and things like that, or appearances. So I try to do like a name, appearance, and a quirk so that it helps them identify who's who. And they've been sad because some of them have died over time, and they really were upset about that because they'd kind of grown to love these people as like non-player characters. So I definitely use them in their game. And I'm also always careful to know that those henchmen or hirelings are there so that if one of the player characters dies, they could take over one of those and start playing it during the game so that they don't miss out on playing. So it definitely kind of builds a little bit of like social depth in the game, the party legacy of having these people, and like people spreading rumors around them, or not rumors necessarily, but like talking them up. So when they give these henchmen and hirelings a larger share of the treasure than would be normal, those people are then going to talk about that, and it's going to become something that gets around so that they can hire more people next time. And it spares the PCs from being the ones to kind of trigger the traps. So I think that's a tough thing, because if you do that and you put them in danger too much, that's negatively going to impact the impression that they're going to give to you when they get back to town, if they survive, and saying that like, oh, this person that hired me made me trigger all the traps and I almost died, or something like that. So, but a way that you can kind of get around that is by having specific types of experts that are good at specific things. And that's one of the things that's in my book that I wrote. I talked about this before, but these are like different experts. And there's a table here at the front where I take the 7 classes from the 1981 BX rules. So from this version of the game, and I kind of tweak them. So you have apothecaries, relic hunters, arms crafters, artillerists, pathfinders, sappers, arcane artisans, arcane investigators, sages, courtiers, merchants, and saboteurs. But those are specific kind of experts that you could hire. And it's just taking one of the core 7 classes and then like making a small tweak to it, and then like maybe giving a little bit of a hindrance to kind of try to balance it. So that's a way I think that you can kind of implement hirelings and henchmen in the game and make it a little bit more specific. But if you're going to use these, some things to watch out for is, again, it's going to slow down your gameplay because your players are keeping track of many more things. And especially during combat, if you've got, you're multiplying your player characters by like, say, a factor of, maybe 2 to 4, depending on how many each one of them's hired. That's a lot more people to keep track of during a combat. And also for the dungeon master, kind of have to adjust to make sure that the combats are going to be, at that level of tension. They're going to be tough based on how many players, hirelings that the characters have. It can be a potential, and I've had to be worried this in my game, for the DM to kind of steal the spotlight. If I get really into role playing one of the NPCs, it kind of can end up using a little bit more time than I want, and I try to keep track of that a little bit. And lastly, just tracking all that overhead, the pay and the employment and the loyalty, like I said, all that bookkeeping can be sort of a chore. All right, so that's our look at henchmen and hirelings. Okay, and then this is the last part. I'm going to go over these very quickly, but these are just some other ideas that have sort of been lost over time. And if there's any of these that you want me to do a deeper dive on, definitely leave that in the comments and let me know. But things like experience points for treasure. So this is a common thing among old school games, is that you got more experience for gold. You got one experience point for every gold piece. And usually you did get some kind of experience for monsters, but it was a lot less than it is now. So the game has sort of shifted. But it used to be the idea of like, you kind of wanted to trick the monster. So you would go into its lair when you knew it wasn't in there, and you wouldn't even bother fighting it because all you wanted was the treasure, because the treasure is what got you the experience points. And getting into a combat was a risky decision because now you're having to expend your resources in order to get that treasure. Whereas if you just waited around until they were on patrol or whatever it is that they're doing, you could again try to sneak in and get that treasure. So the original game really rewarded that, the idea that smart playing got you that experience points versus just tracking how many monsters that you had killed. So the early games really kind of supported this sort of system. But people were even talking about like some early issues of Dragon Magazine where people were talking about sort of alternative experience points things. And talking about how like they didn't necessarily like the idea that you got gold for or XP for gold, but giving other ideas, like even as early as like the early 80s, talking about like story based, and probably even before that, but like, documented in Dragon Magazine, story based rewards. So, it fell out of use, obviously, because modules began to kind of emphasize these like set piece encounters, set piece battles. And the focus became on fighting the monster, fighting the bad guy, and then taking the treasure, as opposed to taking the treasure and not fighting the bad guy. And then later editions, especially when you get into things like third edition, you have this idea of like a challenge rating, right? Where everything's like supposed to be so balanced. And so it sort of removes this idea of the getting gold for XP, because the challenge rating is based on how tough that monster is and then defeating that monster in order to get the experience points. And a lot of people just, in modern games, they think of their characters as heroes. They're not adventurers trying to make their way through the world to get a little coin. So the idea of getting experience points for gaining gold doesn't really track with like these modern heroic tropes that a lot of people like to play that way. So that is one idea. So another idea is is the unbalanced encounters. And again, I have a whole video about this, but it is sort of a concept that people have sort of fallen away from. Unless you play an old school game, most old school games kind of embrace this, but the idea that like you don't know what monster's down there. And so it used to be somewhat keyed by dungeon levels. So you kind of knew the deeper down the dungeon you went, the tougher the monsters were going to be. But knowing that meant you could kind of try to avoid that, but it wasn't always the case. And it could be you might turn a corner and there was like a vampire or a lich or a dragon, and you had to be prepared for that. And usually we'd be prepared by running away as quickly as you could, right? So but modern players, I think there's this expectation that if the DM has put a combat in front of them, that it's expected that the players should be able to become victorious, and they'll expend, depending on the challenge rating, and a party of 4 people, if the challenge rating is equal to the level of the party, then the party will expend a quarter of their resources, meaning ammunition, spells, and hit points, in order to defeat that monster, right? But the expectation is they will be able to do that. And that is the thing that's kind of just gone away over time, this idea that like, again, not balancing it and using player smarts to do research and get rumors and understand where things are so that not to bother things that shouldn't be bothered. So, I think I read this quote somewhere, or it's some of, I'm going to paraphrase, but the idea was like players had to learn that if they opened the wrong door, they were going to die. And so your players had to be very smart and pick how they were going to explore these dungeons. So, it definitely fell out of use over time because players don't like what they consider to be an unfair death or sudden death. Now, it's only unfair if the player's not being smart and doing their research, right? But a lot of players don't like that. They want to use the abilities on their sheet and roll the dice and have their skills or feats help them to maneuver through the stuff. And so they don't like the idea of having a monster that they can't defeat kill them when they're at lower level. There's definitely, the challenge rating system is broken. So, but the idea of like organized play in D&D over time, wanting to have these challenge ratings so that it would make it equal. We talked about tournament play before, that whole series I did on the slavers modules. Well, the challenge rating system is kind of related to that, with the idea of like playing in tournaments or at conventions and having a system for picking the challenge rating of the monster equal to the level of the party. And then again, the story-based campaigns, like these narrative campaigns, don't really support this idea of like, you ran into a vampire and died, and you don't even know why the vampire was there. So it's a different style of play. And so a lot of people just don't like that. And then lastly, the idea of side initiative and morale checks. So this is part of the early versions of D&D. Specifically, I would say like Moldvay Basic is where side initiative is really kind of keyed in. But the idea of like, again, the player's role and the monster's role. And you have this, it's very quick. It's very easy. It's how I run the initiative game for the games that I run for my daughter. You don't you re-roll it every round, but not every player is rolling and then adding a modifier there are no modifiers. You're just rolling it, right? It's you roll a D6 and whoever's higher goes first, right? So but a lot of people don't like that. They want the more tactical things of individual initiative and knowing who's going to go when and delaying and all these kinds of things. So it's a completely different thing. And then also just the morale aspect. Now, there are morale rules in the 5th edition Player's Handbook. I know it's either Player's Handbook or Dungeon Master's Guide. I think it's Dungeon Master's Guide, but it's like buried at the far back, and it's like an optional rule that like how you can use morale in a game. But it is in there. But again, it's not a core part of the game, and a lot of people overlook it. So I think that these are concepts that were, they were a core part of the game at the beginning, but they've kind of gone away over time as things have gone more individual. Individual initiative has become standard because it allows you to be more heroic and take the spotlight during a certain part of the game. And players don't like, a lot of people don't like the morale rules. They don't want the monsters to run away. They want to fight the monster until it dies. And in my daughter's game, monsters run away all the time, as do the players. Okay, but a lot of times, or the players are able to talk a monster down from a morale check because so many, the monster lost so many hit points, or someone on the monster side died, and so the player will make a morale check, and the players have avoided a lot of combats that way, and it makes things more fun for me. But a lot of players don't like that. They want the experience points from killing the monsters. Again, that relation to gold for XP versus monster killing for XP. And then sometimes morale rules, some people think it kind of slows things down. I don't. I think it goes very quickly, but a lot of people don't necessarily like that. So, but again, I use it in my daughter's game as well as using side initiative. So these are all concepts that were part of the game that you can still use today. But you just kind of have to kind of know how to use them and figure out if your players want to use them or not. So to wrap up, these weren't arbitrary rules. They emerged from, real gameplay to correct certain issues or to prevent certain issues. So preventing confusion, table chaos, mapping errors, downtime between sessions. So the caller was helping with group clarity and spotlight sharing. Mappers were giving the players some agency, and also, just kind of some spatial awareness of what's happening in the game. And then, you have one-to-one time, which is keeping the world moving. It's keeping things moving, and it's, between game sessions. And, hirelings are letting these fragile, that's another thing people complain about a lot of times in old school Dungeons and Dragons, is that characters are too fragile. You might have a character with only one hit point at first level. Well, hirelings was a way to help with that and prevent that from happening, prevent your character from dying so quickly. And then overall, like this, again, going back to the one-to-one time and the living dungeons, it really kind of helps the world feel alive. Okay, so as we talked about, you can use these ideas today, but maybe make some tweaks to them. So you can let players elect a caller sort of informally, as opposed to like making it a formal role, sort of like what happened during that game. I mentioned that Brownstein game I played with Dave Wesley. You can use hex crawls or point crawls, however you want to call it, to reward mapping without forcing, like a exact grid. Okay. or you can make hirelings part of like your sort of support group in the dungeon. And that players sort of build over time. So there's no reason to not use hirelings, no matter, again, which edition of the game that you're playing. And then tracking in-game time between sessions. And it doesn't have to be 1-for-1. Again, it depends on how long it's been going on. But just the idea that things happen in between sessions, as long as you don't end in the middle of a combat, I think is a great way to help the world sort of feel alive and involve things like rival factions, like I talked about. And then turning to like things like morale and random encounter checks, things like that become like these sort of it creates the tension, and it creates sort of like these pressure checks where you have to like you're getting anxious about like what's going to happen. Like those morale checks when I do them in my daughter's game, even if the players are the ones that remember, like it's usually the dad player, and he'll go like, wait a second, should you check this guy's morale? And he's usually right, and so I go, sure. And then watching them, the looks on their faces when I roll those 2d6 to see what happens, it does create a little bit of tension for them. And I think it's kind of fun. So, I guess my point is you don't have to run original D&D or any of these games exactly as they're written out of the box. So you can mix and match, and you can take things from OD&D and put it into your 5e game or vice versa. And, definitely checking out some of these old school ideas, you might find that some of these ideas are worth kind of digging back out and putting into your game. And I would love to hear from you guys about that. So, if you are someone who's played old school games, or you still play like I do, like you kind of already know probably how much fun these are, but make sure to tell people in the comments below why it's so much fun, and also make sure that you are using some of these and using them at your table. And if you're someone who's coming to the game from 5e and you are trying to figure out if you are interested in playing an old school game, you might be surprised how some of these early procedures and concepts that we've sort of forgotten about, how they can kind of fix some of the problems that you might have been having that made you leave 5e in the first place. And, it's really just the idea that these procedures, these concepts, these philosophies even of gameplay, they're here to kind of tell a story, not just about how D&D was played back in the day, but how it's evolved and changed over time. So again, let me know in the comments what you think. Which one of these do you think is the most fun? Which ones would you never use? Let me know in the comments below. And while you're down there, you'll find places where you can join me on social media. You'll find links to my blog. And again, you'll find all those links to like my shop and where you can buy my supplement on DriveThruRPG and all that kind of stuff. All of that is down in the show notes below. So thank you so very much for watching. Stay safe, happy gaming, and I'll talk to you next time. And now for the bonus content, what I was drinking and what I was listening to when I made my notes for this video. But there's actually going to be a little bit of a before bonus content or an extra bonus content. So if you are a viewer of the channel for any length of time, especially recently, if you noticed I did my review, our sort of overview and history of the A series of modules, the Slaver series. And in that video, I mentioned that I only owned A2 through A4, and I didn't have a physical copy of A1, so I showed a PDF. Well, one of my viewers, Steve, offered to send me an extra copy that he had. So he shipped that off to me after he saw that video, which I thought was just super nice. So I'm so happy to have a physical copy of A1 to add to my collection. So I just wanted to say thank you for that. I really appreciate that. And then another viewer, this is Michael or Mike. And this goes way back. If you've been a viewer of the channel for a long time, you know that I've talked about how I have this box set from when I was a kid, 1981 Moldvay Basic Dungeons and Dragons. And in this set, I kept my rule book, although I took it out to film the video, so it's not in the box right now. But I kept the basic rule book, and then I would always mention that I kept the expert rule book in this box because I only had the rule book from the expert set. I have the module X1 separately, so I do have both of the components of the box, but I never actually had the box. Well, reader Michael saw that and surprised me. He had just said he had something to send, didn't say what it was, and he sent me an empty box for the expert set. So it's a little dinged up, but really not bad. And It's super cool. I'm just so happy to have this and put it on my shelf. And so I've put my expert book in here already. And I keep my modules in a separate section because I tend to refer to the modules more often than I do the rule books. But no, this is what I would call a Frankenstein box, because the box bottom, I believe, is actually from this is from the basic set. So, but on the shelf, it looks really nice next to my magenta colored basic set. So thank you to viewers Steve and Mike for sending those along. I really, really appreciate it. All right, so let's get into the drinking and the listening. So first off, as far as drinking, go ahead and drop my lemon peel in here. This is a gin old-fashioned cocktail. And as I've mentioned before, an old-fashioned is not a name of a cocktail. It is a style. It just refers to an old-fashioned cocktail with spirit, sugar, water, bitters. And what it meant was that it became popular in sort of like the late 1800s as a bunch of liqueurs and fortified wines and aromatized wines and things were like vermouths were making their way into the United States from Europe. And bartenders were beginning to add those to their drinks to balance out the sugar portion. And a lot of people didn't like that. And so they would go to a bar and they would say, "May I have an old-fashioned whiskey cocktail?" Meaning they didn't want any of that new stuff in there. And they only wanted the, again, the spirit, sugar, water, bitters. And that's how you would order it. You'd say an old-fashioned whiskey cocktail or an old-fashioned scotch cocktail, whatever it was that you were drinking. And so this is an old-fashioned gin cocktail. And so I kind of did some goofy things. Not goofy. I did some fun things with it. So I had made a lavender syrup. So using, lavender, and I infused a simple syrup with that. And then I'm serving it with gin. This is Bombay Sapphire because that's what I happen to have. And I used lemon bitters instead of traditionally an old-fashioned cocktail would use Angostura. And then I garnished, obviously, here you see here with the lemon. Now, I was going to use orange bitters and an orange peel because orange goes really well with lavender. Lemon does too, but I kind of like the orange, how that works. However, I didn't have an orange peel. And I didn't want to use orange bitters and then garnish with a lemon. And so I just went full lemon. So anyway, for my recipe, it's very simple. It's 2 ounces of spirit. I use like a scant bar spoon of syrup. I've seen some recipes where they'll use like a 1/4 ounce. I feel like that's too much. I don't want my drink that sweet. And then I use 2 dashes of whatever bitters I'm using. Sometimes I'll mix bitters and I might do like a dash of each. But in this case, it was just 2 ounces or 2 dashes of lemon bitters. So cheers. So the lavender obviously adds a very floral component to it that really kind of, it plays nicely with the botanicals in the gin. Bombay Sapphire is a little bit more citrus forward, as it is anyway. So you're definitely getting like those lemony citrus notes from the gin, obviously with the bitters. And then again, like I said, kind of that floral. Some people would say soapy or perfumey is probably a better word from the lavender. That's why I don't use that much. So I want to taste it, but I don't want it to be overpowering. And lavender can very quickly overpower things. Okay. Then as far as the album. So to be quite honest, originally I was listening to the soundtrack to Raiders of the Lost Ark because my wife was gone on Saturday night. She went to the Cruel World Festival here in Pasadena at the Rose Bowl, which is kind of like, people say it's sort of like Coachella, but for like older, like Gen Xers. So like the Go-Go's were there and New Order until Tuesday and Death Cult. And so it's the Death Cult is just, they only played songs from the Death Cult era. That's the band eventually became just known as The Cult. So like She Sells Sanctuary and stuff like that. Songs you might have heard, Firewoman, that's from the Cult era. But they dug deep back into their catalog and performed songs from the Death Cult era. Who else is there? I think Nick Cave and the Bad Seeds. Like there was a bunch of cool bands there. So I didn't go. I'm not a festival person, but she is. So she went and my daughter and I stayed home. And I asked my daughter what she wanted to watch. And out of the blue, she said, "Can we watch the Indiana Jones movie?" By which she meant Raiders of the Lost Ark. And that was really cool because she normally wouldn't call something like that. Normally she wants to watch like Gilmore Girls. That's like her new thing, to watch the TV series. And so I thought that was fun. And so then that put me in the mood to like listen to that soundtrack while I was working on my notes. But then I realized I'd already featured that soundtrack here before. And so rather than retread that, I pulled out another soundtrack that I really like, which is this one from 1982. This is Star Trek II, The Wrath of Khan, composed and conducted by James Horner. Now, this is the Mondo release that came out in 2016. So it's a two LP set. Mondo always does a really, really nice job on their stuff, both from the recording quality, but also from usually from the little goodies that they put in. So there's this nice little booklet of liner notes. And this one, because it's the two LPs, so there's an interesting history with this. So the reason that James Horner did the music for this, Jerry Goldsmith did the music for the first Star Trek movie, the motion picture, and I have featured that soundtrack before as well. And they didn't bring Jerry Goldsmith back for Star Trek II because of budget cuts. So he would have been too expensive. They were trying to cut down. And so the studio hired James Horner, and this is one of his first big movie productions. He had done a few scores before, a lot of times working with Roger Corman. And there's a soundtrack that he did. It was a 1980 movie, and I just forgot the name. It's like Battle of the Stars. I forget. It's not, doesn't matter. But a lot of people say that particular score that he did influenced what he did here with Star Trek II, Wrath of Khan. And so, and this kind of helped, I would say it helped make him famous. And later on, he's going to do stuff like the score for the Titanic movie, which won tons of awards and sold really, really well. He worked on James Cameron's Aliens and did the score for that. Like he's done so many things that you guys have seen, but this was one of his very early ones from 1982. So the soundtrack that came out originally only had like 45 minutes of music from a film. The music in the film was over 72 minutes long. And so for years, that's all you could get. And then later on, they put out like additional stuff. So this release came out in 2016. It's unfortunately out of stock, so it would be very difficult to find at this point. So this is 2016 from Mondo. And then in 2021, La La Land came out with a CD version, which I think I also have, if memory serves. And that one includes like basically everything that was written for the movie, plus some additional like alternate tracks. So this one has, the one I have has a lot of tracks that had never been released up until this point in 2016. And so it's really cool. So there's some like alternate takes and things like that as well. So I like Star Trek films. Star Trek II is probably my favorite of the original movies, 1 through 6. I would say Star Trek II. I do like Voyage Home, although I don't like the music for Voyage Home very much. I definitely like the music for this. So, give it a shot. And again, I like listening to instrumental music while I'm writing and taking notes. And so soundtracks, or scores, I should say specifically scores, tend to fit the bill for me. So that's going to be it for the bonus content this time. Thank you so much again for watching and sticking through the bonus content. I hope you enjoyed it. Thanks again to Steve and Michael for sending that stuff over. Thank you for watching. Don't forget to check out some of these other videos. And I will talk to you next time. Cheers.